When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. In number they are like the sand on the seashore. They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet had been. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Now this raises another whole set of interpretative questions. Amillennialists who think that the millennium is already bound up with this entire interadvental period see this now as the final tribulation. This is the great tribulation at the end. And the surrounding the great city, really, it becomes the city of God. It means it's the vilest final attack on believers. And those who belong to the first resurrection, they're so called simply because they have resurrection life. They're Christians. You see? So this is just another way of describing the great tribulation. But if, for the reasons that I've already suggested, that doesn't work for earlier in the chapter, then you're constrained at this point to read it another way. How? Well, there are really two dominant approaches. The approach that is bound up with classic dispensational, premillennial, pre-tribulationism is this takes place literally in the Middle East. The holy city, the blessed city here is Jerusalem. Gog and Magog must be peoples that are connected with the Gog, Magog of the book of Ezekiel. Gog, king of Magog, who is from somewhere up in the Assyria area. And as a result, any number of books have been written to argue that this is the forces of what it used to be said. It's getting a little less believable now, but these are the forces of the USSR that are coming down on Israel. This is going to be the Battle of Armageddon. That is on the plains of Megiddo. And this is the final outbreak at the end of the millennium. Well, I can't think of any simple way of saying that's wrong. But I have to say I'm not convinced. Because what we've seen again and again and again is that the way the book of Revelation uses these Old Testament characters and figures and places, it uses them because in our real history, there's something very analogous going on, but it's using them in a symbol-laden way. For example, Babylon. Babylon really isn't Babylon, it's the Roman Empire, and then through the Roman Empire, any number of things that come along again and again and again. Do you see? Gog, after all, was a real king in the ancient world. Gog, king of Magog. But after all, the Assyrians are all gone. There is no nation like that today, just as there's no Babylon today. So you cannot, on the one hand, say it's literal, only here it's symbol, and say I'm just taking a literal exegesis. Nobody thinks it's the real Babylon. Everybody thinks it's either Rome or Jerusalem, you see? So everybody understands that the real Babylon was literal, but as applied in the book of Revelation, it's no longer Babylon. It's just a symbol-laden thing. Why do we not do the same thing with Gog and Magog? Do you see? And even Armageddon, or the plains of Megiddo, where so many battles were fought again and again and again. If you look at a map of Israel, it's an area where that's right on the trade routes. If you take a look at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, over here you have Greece and Rome, and over here you have the Tigris-Euphrates system with Babylon and all the routes heading east toward India and China. Farther down, the Arabian Peninsula with their fabulous wealth, and then down here you have Egypt and all the wealth of Egypt, the granary of the empire, and so on. And all of them battle right through here, and all the roads come together through little Israel. And one of the best places if you're going to have chariot fights, the ancient equivalent of tank warfare, is Megiddo. And thus it became symbol-laden for the final clashes of the people of God against everybody else. You see? Within that framework, I'm inclined to think that the way the whole book has been using symbols along the line, all the way through, I think that wherever the people of God are who have had the resurrection bodies at this point, during this time of millennial splendor, there are people getting converted. There's still people coming in. But there is such a violent, wicked outbreak against the city of God. That is, against the people of God. That it is the antitype of all the clashes of the battles of Megiddo that have ever been. I think that's where it's heading. And Christ steps in decisively and destroys them with the word of his mouth. Now, it's at that point that finally there's final judgment, and you get this passage, verses 11 to 15, which we looked at a bit last week. Now then, there's a lot more that could be said about that. But let me pause here for questions before we turn to one. Yeah, my only point was this. You see, I said, first of all, there's nothing in the text that says explicitly where those who participate in the first resurrection will reign. Some argue they must be reigning on the earth, where there are a whole lot of other people who are not converted, because they got to reign over somebody. And my answer was, maybe not. In other words, that may be pushing the language in too literalistic a direction. And my parallel was in the parables of Jesus, where some people then, as a result of what they do with the talents given them, reign over one city or two cities or 5 cities. You see, and that's true for all of God's people. So who are they reigning over? And the answer is, wait, we might be shoving this language too far. We may be making it go on all fours, you see. In the new heaven and the new earth, there will be responsibilities. We will be reigning with Christ, supervising this whole created universe that he's made. Well, for all I know, 50 billion other universes. I don't know. Do you see? All I'm saying is that we do look forward to a time of reign and so on, but there's nothing from that argument that proves that they have to be on the earth right now. They may be, but I don't see any way of proving it from the language. That was my point. It was a point in support of agnosticism on this point. I don't know. Okay? Now then, let's come to chapter 21 and 22. Let me come in from the side angle, if I may. In the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 6:19 to 21, Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now that last expression, "where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," is, I think, regularly misunderstood. You may recall that I opened with this passage in the first night. It is frequently taken to mean that followers of Jesus should guard their hearts, or they will be misfocused on purely transient treasures. After all, does not the Bible itself enjoin, "Guard your heart, for out of it flow the well springs of life"? There's a Steve Green song, "Guard Your Heart." But that is not what this passage says. It does not say, "Guard your heart, for your treasure will follow your heart." It tells us rather to invest much treasure in heaven, because our hearts will follow our treasure. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now understand as well that heart, in the biblical sense, does not simply mean your emotions. It means your whole personality. Where you've invested so much, that is what you will think about. That's where you'll go. That's what you'll dream about. That's what you'll go to. Do you see? So, for example, let's say a couple has no children and they invest all of their time and energy and money and daydreaming and resources into building a fabulous house that is really the epitome of everything that they've ever wanted to do and build and own and so on. It will become for them just so much their palace where their heart goes. And they wake up and they think about that their hearts follow. So it is extremely important then for Christians to maintain a high valuation of our destiny, our ultimate home, the new heaven and the new earth. For such a valuation will draw our hearts in that direction. In other words, if we invest a great deal in heaven, as it were, then our whole beings will be drawn in that direction. Where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. Whereas if you've invested most of your energy and time and thought in something else, looking nice or having ideal children or whatever, you have more chance with the former than the second, I suspect. Then that's where your life will go, won't it? Few passages, I think, will prove more helpful in establishing this high valuation of heaven and earth than this one before us. I'll break it up this way. What is new, verses 1 to 8. What is symbolic, verses 9 to 21. What is missing, verses 22 to 27. And what is central, 22, 1 to 5. Repeat, what is new, 21, 1 to 8. What is symbolic, 21, 9 to 21. What is missing, 22 to 27. And what is central, chapter 22, verses 1 to 5. I will be going over those passages again as we go through it. So, what is new, chapter 21, verses 1 to 8. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. He said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To him who is thirsty I will give to drink without cost from the spring of the water of life. He who overcomes will inherit all this, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. What is new then is, quite frankly, nothing less than a whole new heaven and a new earth. A new universe. The language, new heaven and new earth, you find already in Isaiah 65, verses 17 and following. You find it in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 to 13. And in other language, that is without using the precise expression, you find it, for example, in Romans 8, 19 to 22, where we're told that the entire creation groans in travail, waiting for the adoption of sons. You have no new heaven and new earth language there, but it is the same sort of assumption. Where we're heading, finally, is a whole renovated universe. A universe that is in some way connected with this one, but utterly and totally without sin and loss and decay. Now, exactly what this will entail is doubtless beyond, in large measure, our capacity to imagine. Indeed, even what the relationship is between the new heaven and the new earth on the one hand and our old dying universe lies at the very periphery of our vision. In exactly the same way, Paul has some difficulty trying to explain what resurrection bodies will be in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He draws analogies at the end of the day. Well, it's something like the relationship between a seed and a tree that grows, or a seed of wheat and the whole wheat stalk. It's organically connected in some way, but they don't look alike. They have different uses and functions. One is just sort of a microcosm of the latter. Do you see? You're stretching at the very periphery of what God has disclosed at this point. And it is, just as it is extremely difficult for a person who's spent all of his or her life in one culture to imagine what another culture is like. I mean, you get some books on it, and nowadays we see films and videos, and that opens up our horizon somewhat. But before the days of videos and moving pictures, or even stills, to imagine what another culture is like would have been extremely difficult. So how then do we go about imagining what a new universe will be like? See, you're pushing at the very edge of the capacity of the human being to understand and to imagine, to take in. One small detail that John immediately includes, verse 1, is that there's no more sea. Now, I've said already that the sea functions in Jewish literature as a symbol often for chaos. I mean, sometimes it's the real sea that you sail ships on. Ask Jonah. But because they were not a seafaring people, it often served as a symbol for chaos, destruction, danger, even evil. Hence a passage like Isaiah 57 verse 20. The wicked are like the tossing sea which cannot rest, whose waves cast up mire and mud. If you go down to a local lake on a very still day, it's quiet. But a sea, at least where the sea meets the shore, is never quiet. Never, 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 because the tide's always coming in or it's going out. The only question is how high the waves are, but it's always doing one or the other. Now, a sea right out in the middle of nowhere, sailors tell me, occasionally, every once in a while, is glassy. But it's rare. On the shore, it never is. Never, 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 because the tide's always coming in or going out. Now, that's the picture here. The wicked are like the tossing sea which cannot rest, whose waves cast up mire and mud. And then, if you recall, the sea in Revelation 4 standing between John and the throne, I suggested there the most likely interpretation in terms of Jewish usage is the whole fallen order standing between him and God. And then in Revelation 13, if you recall, there's a beast that comes out of the sea and a beast that comes out of the earth. But now John says there's no more sea. I think it is simply another way of saying, not, there are going to be very different hydrological principles in the new universe. John is not interested in the quantity of water that will be there. What he's interested in is there will be no more evil, no more chaos. Then in verse 2, the language changes. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. This is extremely important. This is not meant to be something other than the new heaven and the new universe, or some tiny part of the new heaven and the new earth. Rather, it is another way of depicting the same reality. Do you remember in chapter 5, it's announced to John that the lion has prevailed to open the scroll. So John looks up and sees the lamb, because the lion is the lamb. You're doing that sort of thing in apocalyptic all the time. You're mixing your metaphors, do you see? So here, if you read closely, you don't have two, you've got three. On the one hand, it's the new heaven and the new earth. On the other hand, it's the New Jerusalem. And in the third place, it's a bride. Now, the bride is adorned like a bride at first, but then the bride becomes a central figure a little farther on in this chapter. So you can think of this whole new thing in slightly different ways. And there are different emphases in each case. The bride becomes the figure that actually marries the Lamb. Yes, in that sense, it's the people of God. It's not the whole renovated universe. On the other hand, the city is not, it's more ambiguous. Because on the one hand, the city seems to represent the whole people of God. Yet, on the other hand, the people are in the city. Do you see? They're going in and out of the city. In fact, a little farther on, we'll see what that means as well. So you have what some people call tensive symbols. That is not symbols where you have something that simply represents something else on a one-to-one basis. This represents that. But something that suggests and fills out and is evocative of another whole collection of things. Do you see? It's a tensive symbol. The concept of a New Jerusalem unveiled at Messiah's coming finds its roots in the return to Jerusalem after the exile. The argument was, if we had a New Jerusalem after the exile, a fortiori, how much more will we not have a New Jerusalem at the end of the age? But this is so even in intertestamental Jewish apocalyptic. For example, in a document called the Testament of Dan, written in the 1st century, the New Jerusalem is a place in which the saints rejoice and enjoy the glory of God forever. another document called 2 Esdras or 4th Ezra. It says that the New Jerusalem is not just the old city rebuilt, but a new one built to a heavenly pattern. See, that's just Jewish language. I'm not saying that the Bible is only using Jewish language. I'm saying that it uses the language of the people of the day to convey the truths of God. Do you see? And in the New Testament, these things are taken up again. Galatians chapter 4. Jerusalem that is above. That is not just the earthly Jerusalem, but the Jerusalem that is the very abode of God where the people meet with God. Do you see? Or the city whose builder and maker is God. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 10. In other words, Abraham was looking for a city, but not just any old city, not just an old city in the ancient Near East. At the end of the day, he was looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. That is to be one with God in the people of God. Or Revelation 3:12. Those who remain faithful in Philadelphia are inscribed with the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem which is coming down out of heaven from my God. That is, it's coming down out of heaven and they participate in the New Jerusalem. That is, they participate in the consummated glory. That's the point. Do you see? Thus, the vision of a New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven embraces several intrinsic elements. First, it is the antitype to the Old Testament Jerusalem. The Old Testament Jerusalem was the covenantal center. It's the place where the temple was. It's the place where God met with His people. It's the place from which the king ruled. It's the place where the high priest was. You see? So if you now have a place where prophet, priest, and king is, where the people meet with God, not just annually the high feast, but perpetually, what better thing to call it than Jerusalem? Do you see? Which is also telling you a bit how to read your Bible. There are typological structures already in the Old Covenant that are anticipating this ultimate antitype. The New Jerusalem. Par excellence. Do you see? And then there's the notion of it coming out of heaven. That is, this is an act of God as the creation of the church, as is the creation of the church itself. What finally happens is not just sort of setting up a temporary rule. There's an act of God that just comes in and takes right over. That's what's finally needed. But I think also, this is very important, it is a profoundly social hope. Usually when we do think of heaven, we are inclined to think of heaven in splendidly isolationist terms. Or, going and seeing your mum again, familial terms. But we tend not, most of us in the West, to think of in social terms. Many of us, unless we've sort of brought up in rural West Virginia, tend to think of cities as cesspools. Now, there's some of you who maybe have been brought up in New York. You just can't stand fresh air. And anything that doesn't have buildings at least 40 feet high is already slovenly and amateurish and unsophisticated. There may be some city dwellers like that. But for many, many, many believers, cesspools and cities both begin with C. Sinkholes of iniquity. Yes, glitter. Yes, sophistication. But with a certain concentration of evil. The more people, the more sin. And in a sense, we've already seen that in the book of Revelation. After all, the great city. Babylon the Great. Do you see? But at the same time, the answer is not spread them all out and make them thin throughout the whole universe so you don't get two people conspiring together. But a new city. A new Jerusalem. Not Babylon now, the New Jerusalem. It's a social vision. You see? If at the end of the day you have people who really do know their God and love Him and love each other, the consummated new heaven and the new earth is a wonderful social reality. Wouldn't it be wonderful if in any city people really were selfless to the nth degree and were passionately committed to the other's good in the service of one enduring master? Couldn't the city be a great place? There wouldn't be any loneliness in the city then. It's astonishing that our cities are often connected with loneliness. Bar the door, put on the safety locks, chain. Wouldn't do that in such a city. And then it changes again. She's a bride. What does all this mean? A bride beautifully dressed for her husband. Well, this one's coming out several times here. It's going to show up again in chapter 21, verses 9 and following. Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And then at the end, the marriage supper of the Lamb is coming up. What's going on? What is at stake here? I think that there are several things that are at stake. It's unpacked in part in verses 3 and 4. Let me deal with those first and then come back to the bride. I think that it'll be easier that way. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Now, just that far. This is a fulfillment of many Old Testament hopes and passages. There are many, many passages that speak of God being their God, and he will live with them. That's a common motif. For example, under the Old Covenant, Leviticus 26, 11 to 13. Listen to this passage, Leviticus 26, 11 to 13. I will put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, so that you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with heads held high. Do you see? Now, in the context of the Old Covenant, God being among them and being the people, it was bound up with a tabernacle being put right amidst the tribes, you see? And he would actually be with them. But God manifested himself to no other ancient people than the way that he manifested himself to these people, you see? And that is bound up with the notion of Jerusalem under the Old Covenant as well, isn't it? God takes up his dwelling place in the holy place, the most holy place of the tabernacle, and appears in the Shekinah glory over the Ark of the Covenant between the cherubim, approached by the high priest once a year. It's all part of the whole heritage. God abiding with his people. And then, when the Old Covenant believers look forward to the New Covenant, the same language is used, ratcheted up one. Jeremiah 31. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Now the whole emphasis is on the interiority of the whole thing. You see, it's not just that God is in Jerusalem, but I will put my law in their hearts. Or to use the language of Joel, he will come by his Spirit. Men, women, young, old, he will indwell them, he will be in them, and he will be their God, and they will be his people. The same language, but ratcheted up under the terms of the New Covenant. Do you see? Thus Ezekiel 37:27, my dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And now it's ratcheted up again. Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. So the whole history of redemption, you see, has been, since the fall, God pursuing the people that are his own. And in the different epochs of redemption, dispensations if you like, he's moving in this direction toward the consummation when he is with them and in them and enjoying them and they him in the fullest possible manner, now without any hesitation or contesting or any shade or sin or the like. And that is what is at stake is made clear then by the next verse. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. In other words, so perfect is this dwelling place of God with his people, so consummate this relationship at this juncture, that no sin or evil, or the results of any sin or evil, death, sin, tears, could possibly tarnish it. That's the point of verse 4. Now, admittedly, eternal blessedness here is couched in negative terms. There will be no tears, no death, none of all these things. But that's partly because it's easier for us to understand what it's not in some ways than to understand what it is. We think of all the things we don't enjoy here, and the first thing the scripture writer says is it's not that. Anything you don't enjoy, anything that smacks of death and decay and sin and greed or it's not that. Whatever else it is, it's not that. You see? Which is already giving us some insight into what it is. This too was the language of the prophets. Isaiah 35, verse 10, the ransom of the Lord will return. They will enter Zion with thanksgiving, and everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sighing and sorrow will flee away. Thus they were already depicting that the return to Jerusalem was a kind of type of the ultimate return to the New Jerusalem, if you will. And from time to time in the book of Revelation, this sort of theme has already been introduced, but now in spectacular array. We saw in chapter 7, verses 16 and following, never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst, the sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat, for the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. You see, there have been images of this that have been accumulating in the book in anticipation, and now it's all dropped in. This is the consummation. Not least important here is the abolition of death. No more death. One remembers Isaiah 25:8. God will swallow up death forever. Now, in this connection, then, it's bound up with the knowledge of God, and in this connection, one needs to think through this bride imagery a bit more. This, too, is steeped in Old Testament background. I've hinted already at some of the connections. On the one hand, Yahweh is seen in the Old Testament as the groom of Israel, and Israel is the bride. And then when Israel sins, Israel is apostate. She's committed adultery. And likewise in the church, Jesus is the groom and the husband is the bride. And Paul can say, I can think of the word in French. When I'm tired, my brain goes back into my childhood, and I start thinking in French. I betrothed you to one husband. And in fact, the whole relationship between husband and wife is in some ways bound up with a parallel in Ephesians 5 between Christ and the church. Why that particular imagery? What's it got to say? What's it got to add? New heaven and new earth, I can understand. It's bound up with a complete renovation of everything here. The New Jerusalem, you can understand. The antitype of the Old Jerusalem. What's the husband and wife thing doing? I suspect that what it's doing is this. In human relationships, the consummation of the union between a man and a woman in marriage who really do love each other and care for each other and vow before God to live as God wants, is the closest, most delightful intimacy that human beings can know, this side of knowing God. Now, like everything else, we can turn it into a living hell, but forget that for the moment. It is, nevertheless, in principle and in practice, the most glorious intimacy that human beings can know. Now that is the way we're to think of God and our intimacy with Him. Obviously, it's not a sexual intimacy, but the point is, if you're looking for an intimacy analog, it's the best one you can find. It's warm. It's pleasurable. It's delightful. It is predicated on good communication. It is give and take. It is enduring. It is something with wonderful memories that you look forward to. Put as many positive things as you can to it. You see, only now this is with God. Anybody who has walked with God at all has known some experiences of intimacy with the living God on occasion. Perhaps when you're having your devotions or hearing the Word powerfully preached and you've known the Spirit of God has been powerfully present. And then a little thought clicks in the back of your mind and say, what will the unshielded glory of the presence of the Master be forever? And the best kind of analogy you can find in that kind of context is this kind of intimacy. The consummation of the bride and the groom. So not only, therefore, is it fulfilling a great set of typologies that have tracked down through the Scriptures, you see. It is intrinsically an extremely important image. Just as the city is an important image of the social, so this is an important image of intimacy with God, you see, that must not be overlooked. And now God himself speaks. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. And then for our further confidence, he tells John, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. You see, it's wonderful. All along it's an angel speaks. Or sometimes it's Christ who speaks. But now the one who sits on the throne himself speaks. Almost as if you've come to the whole climax. You must understand now that this has been God's plan all along. God is doing this. God speaks directly. Here you are to have the confidence of the sovereign himself. Write this down. It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Only he can guarantee that the end will turn out that way. To him who is thirsty I will give to drink without cost from the spring of the water of life. This too is language taken from the Old Testament. Isaiah 55, for example, come you who are thirsty, come buy milk buy water without cost from the spring of the water of life. He who overcomes will inherit all this, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. Now this language again is taken from Old Covenant language. Remember how Israel in Exodus chapter 4 is already called my son? Let my son go that he may worship me. Now the new humanity is called God's son. On the other hand, there is probably something here of character that is at stake. Sonship was so often bound up with the repetition of what the Father did. I've mentioned this before in these courses, but it's worth thinking about it again. Most of us do not do what our parents did. In other words, we do not follow our parents in their vocation. But in a pre-industrial world like this one, almost every son ends up doing what his father did, and almost every daughter ends up doing what her mother did. That's the way things get passed on. If your father's a farmer, you're a farmer. Jesus' human father, by all perception, was a carpenter, so Jesus became a carpenter. It was inevitable. It was the way the society worked, do you see? And it's because of that kind of language that some of the son language is functional. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. That is to say, insofar as we engage in peacemaking, we're reflecting God's character and thus showing ourselves to be sons of God. If we have Abraham's faith, then we're sons of Abraham. That's the language of that sort of Semitic caste. That's not meant to be sexist or to exclude women. It is a kind of generic family-orientated thing. That's what's meant. So in this sense, then, these people are all called sons of God over against the people described in the next verse. That is, they have the character of God. Over against the people who are described, the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic arts, the idolaters, all liars. Again, the bifurcation you see between the one and the other. They have become as detestable as the things they loved, whereas the redeemed have become in character like God. Question about that passage? All right. Before we break for the pause, because afterwards everybody just goes off in all directions, could I have the evaluation sheets coming in, please? And any remaining envelopes or whatever. And also that yellow sheet for auditors, if I could get that one back too. That would be a big help. Before anybody moves, if I can get them, it'll guarantee that I don't lose them all. And that too.